Hello there. In today's video, I am going to show you how I made this cute little crop top from one of my husband's old button-down shirts. Overall, I'm really happy with how this shirt turned out, but there were a few mistakes made along the way, which I wanted to share with you today, just so that you can learn from my mistakes and hopefully not make the same ones yourself. Okay, so obviously I've cropped the shirt pretty significantly from the original shape, and I cut off the sleeves to make it a short sleeve design. But the most prominent feature is probably this ruffle that I put into the yoke area. In order to do that, I had to cut out a kind of yoke piece here in the top section and then create a ruffle, which I did with the excess fabric cut off from the bottom here, and then sew the ruffle in between the yoke piece and the rest of the shirt. Now, that seems like a pretty straightforward endeavor, but to complicate things, I wanted to use the yoke to add some shaping into the shirt for the bust area, because as a men's shirt, it was pretty flat in the front and didn't account for the bust. And while I wasn't intending to make this shirt a kind of form-fitting shirt, I did want it to have a little bit more shape in this area. So what I did was, after I cut out the bib or yoke area here, I took an extra centimeter or so from the shoulder and I cut it off in a triangular shape. So I started about a centimeter over and then went down into nothing into the corner of the bib. And likewise, I took off another triangle from this bottom area, starting here and then going off into nothing towards the button placket. And cutting these additional triangles out of the shirt side meant that when I sewed the shirt back to the yoke piece, there was a bit more shaping provided to the bust region, because it's essentially like creating a dart in those areas. Now, when I came up with this idea, I thought I was so clever and that it was such a good way to add some shaping into the shirt. But what I did not realize was that, one, having cut a piece of the shirt out just to begin with, I had created a situation where the sew line was not the same on the outside of the shirt as on the small bib piece of the shirt, which would require the bigger piece of the outside shirt be eased into the inside piece. But furthermore, this was exacerbated when I put the additional shaping into the outside piece. So I essentially made the hole in the outside shirt even bigger, making the sew line even longer and therefore even more different from the inside piece. So to try to explain this better or visually, if I cut the shirt like this, then the sew line to reattach the small piece to the big piece becomes this line for the inside piece and this outside line for the outside piece. And you can see that those two pink U's are not the same shape, or they're the same shape but not the same length. And I further exacerbated this point when I added the shaping to the top, or excuse me, to the shirt piece, because I essentially made the hole in the shirt even wider in these two areas, pulling the sew line out even further and making it even longer. What that meant was that when I was sewing the two pieces back together with the ruffle sandwiched in between them, that I had to gather the shirt piece a bit in certain areas in order to get it to fit. So in the shirt, and I don't know how much this is visible given the pattern of the fabric, but I gathered it a bit at the corners here and a bit at the corners in the back. Now, in the back, it doesn't look that strange because we're used to seeing pleats or gathers in the back yoke of a shirt that to allow for the kind of bulk of your shoulder blades. But the way that I sewed it in was really just kind of winging it and just like easing it in piece by piece. And I think if I were to do this again, I would intentionally put a pleat or two in the back piece so that it just looked more intentional. The other thing I wanted to point out was how I finished this seam on the inside. So this is the inside where those two pieces are attached together with the ruffle sandwiched in between, and I've covered them in bias tape. Again, I thought that covering in bias tape was such a good idea and made for such a clean finish on the inside. But what I didn't anticipate was that when the shirt is buttoned together and closed, there's a tiny bit of the seam and bias tape that peeks out on this side. Now, you can't see it now because I've actually fixed it, but before you could see a bit of it, and the bias tape being this contrasting bright white color, it was quite visible. So what I did was I went back and opened the seam by about 10 centimeters and cut off the edge of the bias tape and instead added a square of the shirt fabric and used that to cover the seam up to the edge. That meant that the cover, the bias tape cover at the edge here is actually made out of the shirt fabric. So we didn't change how visible it is on the outside. It's just that now it is made out of the shirt fabric, and so visually you don't notice it. The other thing I might do differently were I to do this shirt again was where I placed the ruffle. So I started the ruffle at the end of the button placket on this side, went all the way around, and ended it at the end of the button placket on this side. Now this makes it a tiny bit complicated to button the shirt because when you take this piece and you want to put it over that piece, there's that ruffle kind of there in the way. Now I won't try to button it with one hand right now, but it does lay fine when buttoned up and it's not super noticeable, but there's really no point to this additional ruffle that's on the button placket here because it is covered by the other side. So in order to avoid the additional bulk, I would just start the ruffle at the inside edge of the button placket on the side with the buttons. Another thing I wanted to point out about this shirt was with regard to the sleeve. So obviously I've just cut the sleeve more or less where I wanted it, and then I've created a cuff that I then sewed onto the sleeve. So this is not, as it may appear, just a rolled up hem of the sleeve because the sleeve itself is tapered. So meaning that every subsequent circle going down is smaller than above. And so it wasn't really suitable for rolling up because the rolled up piece would be smaller than the sleeve opening and it would kind of give a bunched effect. So in any case, I cut the sleeve and then I created the sleeve cuff separately and sewed it on. Now, kind of unintentionally, when I sewed the cuff on, I left the seam of that connection on the top, so on the outside of the shirt. And I covered it with bias tape, okay, great. But initially I thought, oh, that might be a mistake because you don't usually want the seams to be outward facing. But in this case, the cuff covers the seam, and I've tacked the cuff down so when I'm wearing it, it doesn't roll back up. And what I realized was that although that was not intentional, I do think it actually gives a cleaner overall look, because the sleeve openings here are quite big. And so even when I'm wearing the shirt, you can kind of see inside the sleeve. And if the seam were on the inside, particularly if it were covered in the contrasting white bias tape as it is on the outside, it would be very visible, and that wouldn't be so nice. So actually sewing the cuff on such that the seam is on the outside and then covered by the cuff ended up working out quite well. So I don't know if that's normal and people do that all the time, but I didn't mean to do it that way and was pleasantly surprised that it kind of worked out. Overall, I'm really happy with how this turned out. I've worn it a few times already and gotten some compliments on it. It's very cute. I wear it open or buttoned down. I think both ways are pretty cute. And I look forward to doing some more men's shirt upcycles. Special thank you to my husband who donated his beloved shirt to this project. And thank you in advance for your future donations to future projects. I can hear my assistant calling me from the couch, so I better go. That's it for today. I hope to see you back here for my next video.